Alrighty. Hi, everyone. Hi, panel one. We're excited to be able to share with you a little bit more about building tech ventures. My name is 𝐝𝐞-𝐫𝐢𝐬𝐬, and I am an entrepreneur in residence for the Martin Trust Center and a lecturer at MIT Sloan. I'm a serial engineer, or serial entrepreneur and engineer, I should say, with a focus on startups that are based in emerging economies with an impact focus. My most recent being the development of ultra-portable operating rooms for use in disaster relief and combat-based settings in partnership with Médecins Sans Frontières and the US DoD that's currently deployed in Ukraine. I'm incredibly excited. I have a phenomenal panel of entrepreneurs and experts in the field today, and I'm gonna dive right into the questions and let you guys introduce ourselves. So Lars, if we wanna start with you.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Lars Rasmussen. I'm from Denmark. I am an angel investor. We're based here in Athens. My wife and I work here in Athens. Best known, though, for selling a little startup to Google 1,000 million years ago that became Google Maps.
Just a little startup. No, I'm sure no one's heard of Google Maps.
I'm very proud of that, of course. But now we've started doing angel investments. We've done maybe 75 angel investments in the past 10 years or so, and some of the early ones are starting to do well, like Canva down in Australia, Nira, you'll hear about them soon, Astranis, Bitfury, companies like that. Thrilled to be here. It's very exciting.
Well, Kalimera, good morning, everyone. Well, first I wanted to thank you. Thank the organizers for such a wonderful event and for a great and warm welcome to the speakers. So thank you for that. My name is Maria Zubeldia, and I am the director of the Entrepreneurship Center at Said Business School, University of Oxford. At the Entrepreneurship Center, we focus on fulfilling our students' entrepreneurial ambitions. And I mean, that's easy, it sounds easy, but it's a bit more complicated. And we run a broad range of programs and initiatives to achieve this ambitious goal. And over the past year, I've been shaping alongside a couple of colleagues, one from the wider university and one professor from the business school. We've been working on shaping the strategy to shape, to foster entrepreneurship at Oxford and to take it to the next level, yeah. And well, throughout not only this role, but my previous role, I've had the chance to work with hundreds of entrepreneurs, especially technology-based or science-based entrepreneurs. And I'm thrilled to be here to share some insights and expertise from my interaction with them. So yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the great discussion.
Hi, I'm Marina Hatsopoulos. I co-founded Z Corporation out of MIT, which was an early leader in 3D printing. We grew the business to 30 million in revenues and 125 employees and ended up selling after 10 years. I was burnt out with 4 children, needed a break. And since that time, I've been on corporate boards, public as well as private, small startup, doing a lot of advising of startups. And I was introduced to the Greek startup ecosystem. I'm of Greek heritage. Through MIT Enterprise Forum Greece back when it first started, and I've been so amazed by the Greek entrepreneurial spirit and the talent that's here pursuing startups, and it's really been great to see. We have an organization which is an offshoot of MIT Enterprise Forum Greece based in Boston, which is for Greek startups expanding to the US. It's called Hellenic Innovation Network. And we host events twice a year. We have one coming up in May, on May 4th. So I hope you'll take a look at it and come and see us in Boston. It'll be focused on life science. I'm also a writer, and my writing is at windystreet.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all of the introductions, guys. Now, having been on the other side in the audience and watching panels, it's always fantastic to hear where people ended up. Like, you guys are tremendous experts in your field. You've had phenomenal life experiences, built companies, advised entrepreneurs. But I like to wind it a little bit back. And can we share about, or hear from you guys about what got you started in entrepreneurship as an entrepreneur or engaging with entrepreneurs? Like, what kicked off that journey for you? And what made you decide to stick with it?
I can start.
Open it to the crowd.
Yeah, I mean, so look, I think my parents were into that. My dad was a journalist, quite accomplished in the television and newspaper world of Denmark. And I have possibly inherited his lack of skills in working for other people. And eventually, he went and started his own company, a little journalistic production company, not quite like the venture type companies we deal with today, but and it actually financially failed quite dramatically. And so I both got that bug to be my own master, if you like, but also the fear of how poorly things can go. And so once I grew up, I went through school. I just couldn't help myself. There was a lot in me that was like, no, don't do this, but I just couldn't help myself. Yes, I've been through some successes, some failures. Little by little, I've transitioned to trying to help others go through this journey.
And so it sounds like you were looking for an idea. You wanted to be an entrepreneur, and you were looking for multiple avenues for what that could have been. Does that sound correct? And what made you settle on the first idea for your first company?
Yeah, so actually my first startup experience was not my own. I joined a startup by a professor. So I studied at UC Berkeley, that other American university. And he started a company. We were the first engineers. My brother and I both joined. And when that sort of failed in the dot-com crash of the early 2000s, it was my brother. He actually, so my brother is a college dropout, which is interesting. I went all the way through a PhD. I spent like 1 million years in school. He's the one with the ideas. And he has like drawers full of startup ideas. And when we both got laid off at a time of deep crisis in tech, by the way, he just like dusted off a bunch of them, and he found the one that was still relevant that a small team could build at a time when there really were no investment money. And that was the mapping idea.
Awesome. I'm gonna touch base on that drawer of ideas, but I want to give each of you guys a chance to answer the question of how did you get started in entrepreneurship? What does your journey look like, and why have you stuck with it for so long?
Well, in my case, could be similar to Lars's story, because my dad was an entrepreneur. My granddad was also an entrepreneur. I'm the youngest of 7 brothers and sisters, and 3 of my oldest brothers are also entrepreneurs. So I've been living entrepreneurship since I was a kid, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to work on the field. And I mean, I launched my own, a couple of 2 ventures. One failed dramatically, and one was good, but it was self-employment opportunity around consultancy on innovation. But there's been always an inner part of me that was challenging the status quo, constantly try to do things better, and I found that the entrepreneurship field resonated very strongly with that. So I would say that that's probably why. But it hasn't been conscious decisions constantly necessarily, but it's been kind of just following sometimes the instincts probably.
What feels right. Yeah,
Yes,
which is absolutely critical, both as an
Gut
entrepreneur
feeling.
and making sure, I mean, you want to be analytical, but you also have to understand and follow with your gut, and as a career decision, like what feels right for you in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't have to all answer every question, but Marina, this is such an important one of how did you get started? I'd love to hear your answer as well.
Yeah, so I grew also, my father was an entrepreneur.
Just family business.
Yeah.
Was that part of the selection criteria?
And so I grew up he founded Thermoelectron, which is now Thermo Fisher. It's a big company. And so I grew up on Saturdays running around the halls and stealing candies from the secretary's desks and kind of, drawing on the whiteboards. Like that was our life as kids, kind of seeing what it was to be an entrepreneur. And he was very passionate about it. He loved it. And so I always had in my mind that I wanted to be a tech entrepreneur, and then was just looking for an idea to commercialize. And I found even after we sold the company, I didn't want that feeling of the world on my shoulders, which you feel as a CEO. But I really wanted to remain connected to that world because I love hanging out with entrepreneurs. I mean, I just think they're a great bunch of people. And I was just ruminating on this the other day because I spend most of my time now writing, and yet I don't really feel that same connection with writers that I feel when I see entrepreneurs. Like there's just a connection there. There's some kind of a spark, which is
I love that. And in case just for everyone in the panel, entrepreneurship does not have to be a family business. My mom is a librarian, so not in the family. I wouldn't call myself a black sheep, but certainly got some weird looks when I said I was starting a company. So you don't have to have grown up with it.
Well, that's actually very relevant in Greece because a generation ago, when if you said you were an entrepreneur, you know, people might have looked at you funny, like, no, go be a doctor, go be a lawyer, go work for the government. And so this is a new thing in Greece where people are starting to realize that it's a reasonable aspiration.
Oh, absolutely.
And I guess in Spain, we have a very similar culture than the one in Greece. And I remember my mom, when I wanted to travel abroad to improve my English. Many years ago, I was working for a bank. She was like, oh no, but what are you doing? Why don't you work for the government? So really, being married to an entrepreneur, she only wanted that I work as a civil servant. That was her sort of, I would have made her the happiest person in the world if I would have told her that I was joining the government, which I actually worked for the government a few years later. But it's that cultural piece, very important.
Yeah, I mean, it's a running joke in my family that no one knows what I do. Like, she's doing something with companies and startups. And so, yeah, there's definitely a dynamic of what are you doing and why, particularly if it's a new idea. And the panel is focused around ideas and how do you find an idea, and that's always an interesting question. I want to ask you guys of it. But I also find more interesting is what do you do with that idea? Like, there are drawers of ideas everywhere, and what do you do once you have it? So both of you guys mentioned, like, you were looking for an idea, you had a drawer of ideas. Like, what made you go forwards with that, and what was some of the process and the steps that you took to validate that idea and to see if it was turning into a viable company?
Yeah, so I can start since I mentioned the drawers. And so you have to see the time was a little different back then. So there'd just been this phenomenal stock market crash centered around technology in the early 2000s. All the investors were losing money. Like, the entire tech scene, I think, turned over just a few tens of billions of dollars of revenue every year, like the entire industry. So a very different time. And no one was hiring at all. I mean, much, much worse than now. And so we were looking through my brother's drawer. It was really my brother who was doing the looking, right, for an idea where a small team could have a big impact. So he had other ideas that required more resources, more people, that we actually then attacked later after Google Maps, an idea that he had at the same time that we deliberately waited to do. And Maps was the answer. And some things that made that attractive is that the field, so we're now 3 years ago, was stagnant. That there had been this spout of innovation, a company called MapQuest in the US has kind of started.
I remember MapQuest.
Mapping sites, right? And everyone had copied it. So everyone had very similar map sites to MapQuest. Like Yahoo was a big player back then, had one. Microsoft had one. Other countries had their own local version of it. And then everything had stopped. And my brother had this vision for a way to make it dramatically better. And he wrote this to me, actually. It was like less than a page worth of text, right? It was basically, we can make them faster, bigger, and prettier. And then he had some technical ways to do that. And so it was the right thing to go for. And I often talk about this, that back then, a big driver was just the fact that no one was hiring. Right? So that safe bet and going to get a job wasn't really around. And there were several times in our journey where it seemed like it was going to fail. And we should just give up, pack it up, go home. Like, we tried to raise money maybe 6 to 9 months into the journey and just completely failed. We didn't even get a call back from any investors. And we were ready to pack it in. But the fact that no one was hiring made us continue. And so I'm actually thinking that this rounds of layoffs that we're seeing now is actually quite good for the innovation ecosystem worldwide, because it is tricky when you can go and get a $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 job at a Google from just having a college degree. It can be hard to find talent when you're starting a new company.
It de-risks it slightly because your alternative is less attractive. If there isn't a great job market, like, it makes more sense to, well, why don't I try out this new thing?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, the risk you're taking, right, is that you're willing to work for less cash. In our case, zero cash, in an all equity, right? But even today, where you can go and raise VC money, right, your take-home cash tends to be lower than if you go work for a Google or a Facebook or a big company like that. But you get equity to make up for that.
Right.
And that equity can turn into, like, if we're just talking finances, it can turn into even a life-changing event some years out in the future with very low probability. Although I would say the the professional satisfaction of having created something that quite a lot of people use around the world is, far more satisfying than the financial gain.
I love that you mentioned MapQuest. I don't know about you guys, but I have particularly trauma-informed memories of MapQuest. I was moving into Boston, and Boston is a chaotic and not organized city, and I would print out the MapQuest sheets.
Right.
Yeah, and I would have them, and if you missed a single step, you were done. And so I would just have these pages of sheets that were no longer
page
relevant.
to the right.
Yeah, I'm 21 and I'm trying to figure out and get apartments and rent, and I'd be frequently calling up my friends being like, so I'm on the corner of First Street and Main Street, where am I? Can you tell me if I need to go right or left? So I'll always remember those. It's part of my formative introduction to Boston. But Marina, you mentioned ideas and looking for an idea. What did that process look like for you, and what did the idea validation process look like for you?
Sure. So I had the idea that maybe my master's thesis would be an idea for a startup. But what I created, it was an urban mobility device, and it wasn't really patentable. There was too crowded a space. So then I actually spent a year looking for a failing business to turn around, and I found that those were failing for good reason. There was no product differentiation, no intellectual property. So then I went to the MIT Technology Licensing Office that pays to patent inventions made by the students and the professors, and then looks for individuals and companies to commercialize them. And it was just this amazing thing where they had a dozen very unique technologies that were patented that they were looking for people to commercialize. And so this was one of the projects that they were looking for someone to license and take to market.
That's fantastic. I love that both of you guys described the two different types, I think, of ideas moving into the market. Is you've got the tech push of, I have this great thing, where does it belong and how can I advance it? The technology is already there. And then you have the market pull, what does the market need, what doesn't exist, and how can I build something to meet that demand?
Yeah, I view that as either it's a solution looking for a problem or a problem looking for a solution. And so I think you had a problem, you had a solution for it. And in our case, it was a technology looking for a market.
Exactly, yeah. I think that's such a helpful framework of thinking about, okay, what area am I attacking this from and what do I have? But Maria, you work with students all the time, so I'd love to hear your perspective, because having had students come to my office hours, they're also usually looking for idea validation.
Yeah, definitely.
And often I tell them I can't give them that. I was like, I'm not an expert in this field, and I also can't, there are steps that you need to go through. I could think it's a horrible idea, and it could be amazing. So what does that look like from your perspective, and what are your thoughts on ideas and processes?
And you made a great point, because one of the most frequently questions I get is so what do you think about the idea? So they explain to you the business, and it's, so what do you think? And I say, well, it's not useful for you to. I'm not either a prospect or a potential customer, so you shouldn't care what I think about your idea. But it's very funny, because we have here both examples of problem and solution driven initiatives, and I have to say that I always tend to fall or lean towards the problem based one, even though at Oxford we have a program exactly like the one you described, where just patents that are filed in a drawer and nothing is happening, they are open and available for students willing to, which is a great opportunity, don't get me wrong. But what I often find when speaking with students is that, well, the problem they want to explore, I would say probably 85% of the times change slightly when they dig deeper on the need and on the problem. And having that research orientation, really having conversations with the problem holders and identifying those users or potential customers who are deeply frustrated because there's nothing in the market that is satisfying the need. Because sometimes I find a lot of solutions that are kind of, oh, this is going to solve this problem, yeah, but are the customers really frustrated because they can't find anything else, or they are just really literally doing nothing to solve that need. So when you find a need, but also you dig deeper, and then you realize that actually that need is not solved in a good way or in an effective way, then is when there is something interesting there. And I would say for me that's kind of the main feature.
Yeah, I love that point, and I'll highlight it, is they come to you with ideas and you're like, I'm not your prospective customer, so I'm not the best person to validate that idea. Like, you could think it's great and you might be the only person in the world, or vice versa. And figuring out who is your user, what is their pain point, is such an important part of that process. Yeah. Having gone through that process, how did you guys go about that user validation, making sure that this was a problem that the market needed and that there was going to be demand for it?
Well, I could start. So there was a proof of concept that two of the engineers working at MIT had developed, and so it could make sample prototypes from this machine. And so I would take them to trade shows and get feedback from the market. But interestingly, the feedback was like, your parts are crappy, which they were, because the existing market was very expensive equipment that made beautiful parts that were, the parts themselves cost maybe $1,000. It took a day to a week to fabricate. So it was a whole process using toxic materials. The equipment was big and bulky and difficult to operate and was in, a separate space. Whereas what we were trying to do is make it very quick and easy, put it in an office environment, and make 50 prototypes early in the process. So this issue of customer validation is so important, but it's also like you have to be careful listening to the customer, because I'll never forget them telling me how crappy it was, and I'd say, okay, yeah, they're kind of crappy. Send me your file and I'll build you your part, and then tell me what you think. And that's when the light bulb went off, when they would see their part in their hand in an hour, instead of waiting a week and paying $1,000, and we would build it for free. And they'd say, oh, now I see I could use this differently than what I'm doing today. So we're talking about a change in process.
Yeah, because the problem that you were solving was not making a better part, it's making it more quickly.
Exactly.
So making sure that your team understands, or even the user understands, that this is the issue we're trying to address, because sometimes users don't necessarily know exactly what hole you're trying to fill for them.
Exactly. And so one of the ways we tried to communicate this is we were the only ones at trade shows that would have big, big bowls full of free sample parts. And so we would just give them away to customers and they could take a part home, which you would never do with the competitors, because they were so expensive.
Yeah, and Lars, what did your user validation process look like?
Yeah, so in our case, honestly, we were our own first users. And we very much and enthusiastically built the mapping site that we wanted. And that turned out to work super well in this case. And then for our next attempt at entrepreneurship, also my brother's idea, a project called Google Wave, which you will not have heard about because it's failed just as spectacularly as Google Maps succeeded. But we used exactly the same idea. And the big failure here is that our needs in mapping was completely aligned with the mass market we're trying to address. I have no sense of direction. I get lost in my own 3-bedroom apartment. I really need maps for like day-to-day life. But in communication, my needs is completely not aligned with the market we're trying to address. And so that's the really important thing. The other thing is that we hacked up, so we're software engineers by training, so we could hack up a demo, completely fake demo. It was really just a front end without a back end, and sometimes we just cheated, and we demoed. We tried to find people that we could and just showed it to them and just saw their reaction. And a lot of the ideas we had was just like watching people interacting with our demo. Another thing I'll say is that when I look at my portfolio, some of the really successful things like Canva that we helped invest in 10 years ago, which is now a company with 125 million active users, valued at tens of billions of dollars. It's like crazy success. And here, the entrepreneur, Melanie Perkins, she's a graphics designer. She was a student when we met, and she had actually been teaching people to use the incumbent players' tools. Adobe still is the biggest player in graphics design tools. And she had just like observed how difficult it was for non-professional designers to use those tools. Of course, there's many, many more non-professional designers out there than the professional designers Adobe addresses right now. So she just like completely nailed through that teaching process, what is it that people like who's running a hair salon, they want to design a flyer for their shop. what kind of tools do they need, so they don't have to come to me and spend 6 months learning how to use the incumbent tools. And they actually then tested this out by building an entire company. I'm not recommending this, but by the time we met, they had built an entire bootstrap company for a very, very small subsection of their big ambition, which was happened to be designing yearbooks for schools, right? So they had actually built a whole UI where a teacher could go design a yearbook, look great, and then they would actually ship physical books to them. Validated that completely bootstrapped, and they came with that story to me and a bunch of other investors, and they said, look, we're going to take what we learned from here and from my experience teaching in this field, and we're going to turn it into the biggest company in the world. I remember saying, you mean the biggest design company in the world? And I said, no,
Like,
no, the biggest company in the world, right? And when they hit that $40 billion valuation, they literally did give a presentation to all the investors going, so let's see, like we're about 1% there to building the most valuable company in the world. It's a great story. Actually, the last thing, if I can just say, a thing to look out for is that, like when you approach investors like me or like VCs, it's not always the case that the thing that gets you a bunch of yeses is then the thing that turns into the successful company. And so Canva in particular went through 200 pitches of no's before they were able to put together even a seed round. Crazy, and I have this great collection of all the reasons that investors gave why this was not going to work. And typically about, in this case, that there was a big incumbent player that kind of ruled that space, Adobe, and it was impossible for a startup to do anything. Whereas other fields, I mean, we all know these stories, right, that when someone had the idea of making electric scooters for subscription, right?
Yeah.
Billions and billions of dollars got thrown at these companies all around the world very quickly, right? And not any of them, I think, has really worked out and made a return for those investors.
And they are deadly to drive on. I have been on them today.
Yeah, and so often these really like impactful companies come from an insight that's not obvious to other people, right? Where the entrepreneur, typically from a strong personal experience, has some insights that are not actually the easiest to sell before you get started, at least.
I mean, I love that point because I think it speaks about idea validation. Like similar to how Maria and I have students coming to us looking for idea validation, I have had fellow entrepreneurs and even expressed it sometimes myself of, well, what are the VCs going to like if they invest? It must mean it's a good idea. Which they may or may not be your target customer. They have an understanding of what your target customer looks like. So it is validation in some sense, but it might not be the necessary one. You said Canva went to over 200 before they got a yes. Like those people didn't understand necessarily the potential of the market. And I love the point that you made earlier, Lars, so I'm gonna highlight that too, because you're like, well, for Google Maps, we were designing for ourselves. Like we were our target customers and there were so many more of us. And you're like, for Google Wave, we were still designing for ourselves, but there wasn't a lot of us like that in that aspect. And I think that's so valuable because when you are, like if you're solving your own problem, it can feel so important, but you might be the only person with that problem.
Exactly, yes. And I still run into people who are in love with Google Wave. Like, I can't believe that didn't work out, right? I'm like looking at a mirror image of myself. Like, yeah, you and me both. But you gotta make sure, right, that those people, whether it's yourself or others, that you test against with your demos, your prototypes, your pitches, and so on, really truly represents the market you're trying to address.
Yes.
And it is possible we could have made Google Wave work if we had addressed a different audience, because we wanted to build another mass market success. We started Google and it just wasn't the right product for that.
So let's talk about the testing dynamic then. Maybe not testing in the way that I think we traditionally think of as like, is this failing? Is this metric based? What's the quality? But how do you test to see that there is a customer response, like that there is both a market demand, the customer is going to be there, and that's sizable enough? How does that factor into all of your processes?
Well, I think you need to try to get money out of their pocket. That's really, until you do that, you don't know. Like everyone's like, oh, great idea. That's such a great
Particularly
idea.
your friends and family. They're
And-
like, oh, great idea,
Yeah.
great idea, okay.
Totally different than actually getting someone to part with their money. That's when you know. And so I think the best way is to get a prototype as close as you can get to a real product. And if you can't fake it, like, you know, in software, it's pretty easy to do kind of a fake software to give people an idea for it, and then have them pre-order and say, you know, we'll give you 20% discount if you pre-order. And that's when you can start telling if you're actually solving a real problem or not.
Yeah, just to build on your point, Marina, I find a lot of entrepreneurs really want to reach out to investors or VCs to test whether the idea is investable before actually having any traction in the market. So I always kind of insist, well, just gain some traction first, and then you can approach an investor because you're at the right time to then check. So I would say, like, acting in a lean way, try to also fail fast, learn quickly, and early interaction with the market. What you did with your crappy sort of, that was super, super, super useful.
Well, super good point. So what can I add that you haven't said already? I guess I tend to work a bit in consumer software, where there's not necessarily a need for someone to pay money. This is particularly true of Google, of course, that's advertisement funded. Things to look out for. Books are written about this. Is the crossing the chasm concept, right? So like with Google Wave, we actually did a very detailed demo on stage, sort of like this. Standing ovation, and we put the demo on YouTube. It's like more than an hour long, and I think 10, 11 million people have watched this demo. Comments are glowing. We put out a beta with the sign-up list. We got 4 million people signed up overnight to try this out. Started selling invitations on eBay. Still totally failed, right? Because we couldn't cross that chasm from the 4 million people that's just like Lars. So there's more than 2, but 4 million is still not, you know, a mass market Google size, right? It's still completely failed.
But I think it's important to recognize, like, for Google, 4 million is nothing. But for a small company that has a low level of investment, 4 million could be gangbusters.
No, but that's exactly the thing. I'm saying that if we hadn't been inside Google, I was only interested, and we knew that, you know, this is not a secret, only interested in billions of people, right? We could have possibly made Google Wave a success with a different audience and a different approach, right? So you have to be careful about this. I'll just say also in the positive. So Canva again, they built a prototype. Actually, they got very close to launching this thing, and then they went through a series of like deliberate user tests, right, where you invite people into a lab-like setting and you present them this new, almost finished product, and you see how they interact with it. And what I'm used to is to kind of you look at how easy it is to use, and you try to deal with usability and so on based on this subjective feedback from individual users. What Canva did, though, was a little different, because their key thing was to make it easy for non-professional designers to design something that looks good. And actually the whole theory was we're going to make a tool where it's going to be hard to make things not look good, right? If you pick one font and you want another font, we're only going to show you the fonts that are aesthetically matching the first font, right? If you pick one color and you want a different color, we're only going to give you the colors that are color theory-wise compatible with this, right? And so that's all they did. They got people into lab. They said, design a flyer for your birthday. And then they just let them design it. They send it home, right? And then they looked at it, and anything that wasn't looking good, they blamed themselves for that, right? And then they made and changed the tool so that not attractive thing would be difficult to do. And this actually took a long time. They spent almost a year on this process before they launched it, and then the second they launched it, it took off like crazy.
Yeah, it's fantastic user testing of figuring out what they want and what they need.
Right. And again, making sure, of course, that the people they invited in were of the right type relative to the market they wanted it to address, right? Which was specifically, in this case, people who care about design but are not trained as designers.
Which I think is such an interesting component, because had they been reaching out to designers and done that same exercise of design a flyer for your birthday, they might have designed something beautiful even without that I'd say the user fail or the
Right.
design challenge, which I'll put myself in that crowd with. And so
Yes.
they was like, oh, well, this is an important feature. So making sure that you're reaching out to the targeted audience and knowing who that is, it sounds like it is absolutely critical. But maybe to kind of like, I understand frameworks are so important, particularly if people who are listening are interested in starting their own startup. Like if you guys were to go back, or not even go back, if you guys were to start your own company tomorrow, what would be the first 3 things that you would do? What would that process look like for you?
Well, probably I'll start here. This is a difficult one. But if there is one thing that I've learned from the past failure that I had, is focus. And keep the focus. And it seems very easy and basic, but it's actually very difficult to do, because you have, it's quite rare that you have a customer that asks you exactly for what you are offering. And you find a huge amount of people asking, oh, can you do this? Can you do that? And obviously you want to get some cash and gain some traction. So you have a strong temptation of saying, okay, well, I'll go that way, and you end up losing the focus. And I would say that's, for me, I would say that's the biggest learning I've had. And the second thing I would add is that I always say that it's good to be stubborn a little bit, but don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm surrounded with amazing entrepreneurs, and it's very good to listen to customers and to seek advice from mentors. I think it's super important to have that open mind to gather feedback. But at the same time, I think sometimes you just need to just be a bit stubborn and don't make all the decisions based on that feedback. You need to, because you are the one who sees the opportunity. So it's about believing in yourself, not only in yourself and on the need, especially if you are suffering that need, that that you become highly passionate about it. And I think that's an amazing ingredient for any entrepreneurial team. So I would say that's kind of the second thing. Well, and the third thing is the team. For me, the team is just the key aspect of any entrepreneurial idea. I've seen the majority of the ideas pivoting somehow, changing slightly or dramatically. And surrounding yourself, being humble to recognize what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses, and fulfill those gaps by bringing people alongside that covers that and brings the relevant expertise to launch that idea forward. That would be the third sort of key point I would highlight.
I saw you nodding along to some of those.
Yeah, I think team is everything, because a strong team will, you're not going to be right on from day one. You're going to need to pivot here and there, and a smart team can figure it out. And a team that isn't competent, even if they were perfect going after the right market, they're just going to botch it at the end of the day. So, and a perfect team isn't all like with the top resumes or whatever. It's a question of being complementary, having a diverse set of skills, interests, experience, talents, and it's that magic mix that makes for a really strong team.
I love that. And Lars, you've started 2 companies with your brother, maybe more than 2 companies with your brother. I'd love your thoughts on team. Like, how did that dynamic go for you? What did you guys look to do to bring in outside voices, and what maybe would you have done differently?
Yeah, super good question. So when we started the Maps thing, it was actually just my brother and I for the longest time. Only like nine months into it, we get 2 other engineers both to join us, because we had no money to pay for anyone. And we were actually just the 4 of us when we sold to Google. And so then, our next company, which is actually kind of a mock company inside of Google, down in Australia, Google threw resources at us, like $25 million in investment, 60 engineers, office space, all the administrative stuff that Google had. And here, look, we just hired the best programmers, designers, product managers we could get. So we're very focused on the development team, trying to find a product market fit, and then bring in sales, marketing, those kinds of things, for better or for worse. I heard one of the previous speakers make this great point that the first thing you want to do with your team is realize what you don't know, what skills you don't have, and bring those in. And in fact, this was one of the things we really helped the Canva founders with, because unlike my brother and I, the Canva founders are not software engineers. So Melanie, the CEO, is a graphics designer, and her partner Cliff is, he was a business student, so they were both students when I met them. And the introduction was literally from an investor who said, Lars, these guys have something, but they don't have a tech team. And so if you go and help them recruit a team of engineers that you'll sign off on, I'll invest. It was actually shorter than that. We've saved this email. It was both to Mel and me. And so that's what we did. That's how I helped. I had luckily just left Google in Australia and had been out for just long enough that I was allowed to go and poach some of these people, right? And so I helped them recruit the guy who's now their Chief Product Officer, Cam Adams, from the team I'd worked at actually on Google Wave, Google, and then Dave Herndon, who's now their CTO, both joined. It took a year to get from the introduction to the point where they had a tech team that allowed them to raise that money. 200 no's later, it was quite a long journey before they even started writing code. I think I'd known them for a year and a half, 2 years.
Yeah, and I think what I'm hearing from the two of you, and there's an audience question on co-founder and building a team, so I want to dive into this a little bit more. What I'm hearing from both of you guys, which I wholeheartedly agree with, is to know what your competencies are, and then to fill in. Like, you don't have to know everything, but you have to be self-aware enough to say, where am I an expert and where am I not an expert? Which makes me think of, what is it, the saying of, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. Like, if you think you can do everything in your company, you're starting the wrong company. I think that could be translated. But what are your guys' thoughts on building a team? Like, how do you go about it? What are your thoughts on solar founders? And what qualities do you look for, either for companies that you would start yourself or when you're advising others?
Well, for us, we had 2 on the technical side and 2 on the business side. We were all engineers, but 2 who were really focusing on the product development and 2 who were focusing on the market development. And that worked out really well because, in those early days, the tech team is staying up all night getting the machine to work for the demo. And then, we could walk in fresh in the morning and do the demo and
just a 24-hour shift going on there.
Yeah, exactly.
With some sleep, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. And they're very different skills and interests. And I always just felt, as a co-founder, so grateful that there were these other people on the team who knew how to do these crazy things and had these crazy out-of-the-box creative technical ideas. And I think likewise, they were grateful. They had no interest in the business side. They were just like, you do it. And so I think there's something really special when that all works out. In our case, it was sort of, we didn't go out and look for them. We found the technology, and these 2 guys were working on the technology. So it just kind of happened.
And what advice do you give students when they're looking to build a team? And we get a lot of questions, I think, about finding co-founders. So if you can touch upon that, I'd love to hear your experience with that.
We actually have several programs to support them finding a co-founder. I would say at Oxford, a solo founder is just really a no-go.
Why is that? I'm going to poke into that because the same as at MIT or within the Martin Trust Center as well, but we get a lot of people who want to be solo founders. So what is your perspective on that, and why is it?
Yeah, I mean, if you are a visionary leader and you need to be able to build a team around you because of what we said about bringing complementary skills to yours. And just, I would say, when I see a solo founder, that's if it's very early and, it's just starting developing the idea, then it's fine. But if not, I would be even worried, thinking because I often find many of those entrepreneurs, solo founders, obsessed with their idea, and they are, I would say, too stubborn. So I said it's good to be stubborn to some extent, but these are the ones who are really difficult, and nobody wants to work with them. And for me, it's a red flag, definitely, from that perspective. And we run a lot of programs to support them. We have even kind of an advert. I'm looking for a co-founder. If you want to join, to make it kind of exciting. But I always say, having a co-founder, for me, is like getting married. So it's like you just need to have a lot of discussions around what the expectations are, what your values are, what you envision for the future, to make sure that there's no, because we find one of the biggest probably reasons of failure from the startups that we work with and we have within the ecosystem is because of a conflict between co-founders. and it's a real shame. So if you bring some early conversations, discussions to make sure that you know you are aligned and you are looking for the same thing, you somehow avoid. I mean, there are some tools like Founders Agreement, and we run some sessions on that with legal experts. That helps you a lot, but I think that's probably the most important part at the beginning.
Yeah.
Yep. So if I can do,
Go for it.
just my personal experience, both as a co-founder myself, I've always had a co-founder. My brother twice, my Greek goddess wife who was here once, and well, twice if you count our angel investment. That's a separate thing. But when I look at my portfolio, all of the successful companies in there have co-founders that had a deep history before they started that company. And if you look at the, luckily not very large number of companies that failed, where I identify co-founder dynamics as part of the reason, all of them have the property that it was one founder who deliberately went to look for a co-founder to do this thing. And so I worry that this notion that you should go find someone to do a company with, and it's not someone that you have a deep history with, that's dangerous, right? Because you have to, it's like getting married, right? To do this journey together, you have to be, I mean, you have to have a vision that's aligned, but you have to also be able to work through the difficulties that come when you're under tremendous pressure. Things are not going well, your missions are not, you have maybe different ideas. Can that dynamic work, or does it blow up? And I think I'm much more comfortable investing. Actually, interestingly, I meet investors who are like fundamentally opposed to investing in people who are also couples in their private life, right? And so to me, that's worked super well. I mean, 𝐤𝐶𝐚 was founded by a boyfriend, girlfriend. They're married now. They have a kid. It's worked out super well. So there you go.
You've got to be able to have those tough conversations. We have quite a few questions from the audience, so I'd like to switch gears to that. We have someone who's asking, what would you advise to someone who has an idea for a startup business, but not on a subject that he's an expert on? For example, a tech application, but without any programming knowledge, but he has economics knowledge. I think we've touched upon that a little, but if anyone wants to add a little bit more color to that topic.
Well, I don't think you need to, if you're not an expert as to how to execute, I think that's totally fine. You need to become an expert on the market. And so I don't think you can start a company without becoming an expert in the market. You need to pretend you're the customer and try to find every possible solution so you really deeply understand what your other available options are before you offer another solution.
And you need to bring an expert in the team on that
diverse
you are
skill
not an
sets.
expert. I would add that, I mean, we find that very often with this patent and IP program where, business school students, they have a sort of business background. They are not experts in the technology. And the first thing they do is they analyze the market to assess where that opportunity can fit and where that, what market is more interesting for them. But then they need to make sure that they bring that expertise somehow in the team at a later stage, probably once they've decided, okay, I want to kind of probably go into this market with this technology. So it's the same what you did. Mm-hmm. But I think you need at some point to bring that expertise in the team.
Absolutely. And Marina, on that note, this question is specifically for you. You mentioned that after your master's, you looked for failing companies to turn around. Mm-hmm. How does one go about that search, and how did you introduce yourself to the companies?
So I went to there were a lot of business brokers, and then there were like some shows where companies would present. And I presented myself as, I'm looking to find a business to turn around. And they were always very eager to kind of unload their babies. Typically, they'd spent 10 or 20 years and it was kind of not going the way they had imagined. And so they were just exhausted. I mean, let's be honest, being an entrepreneur is exhausting. And whether it goes well or not well, it's exhausting. And but at the end of the day, as I said, there was no IP there, and nothing that I was going to be able to help bring to the table.
We have another question, and I'll open it up to the whole group for who wants to take it, because I feel like we've touched upon this in some of our discussions, is do I have to come up with an idea of a product that everyone wants, or is it all just about discipline, belief in the idea, and hard work?
Well, so you have to come up with an idea that the target audience wants, not
Someone has to want it.
not everyone, right? And often you have to find that thing, I mentioned this earlier, right, where it's not necessarily obvious to everyone you talk to originally, early on, that this is the right thing to do. And often, I mention this a lot when I talk to people, like all the successful entrepreneurs I know have this almost pathological sense of optimism, even though odds are clearly against them in every possible way, right? They're just like convinced that this is going to work. And I think that's the quality to look for. Like you have to be right. And a lot of times these big, the most important companies are made where it's really like the gut feeling, the insight of the founders, the unusual insight that they had from their journey in life that really makes a difference.
It's a little bit of trust but verify, right? Like you've got to believe that it's happening, but you have to find that other people are also going to believe, either on your team or your customers. Because if you're the only person who's believing it, that's probably a red flag. And you mentioned that too, Maria. If you're the only person, you might want to verify a little bit more.
Well, and to build on Lars, definitely I would say not the first option. So don't go for an idea that the idea doesn't need to be that everyone loves it. No way, because that's never going to happen. And the more focused and niche that you operate, fewer people will understand the need that you are solving. So discard the first one, go for the second part of the question, definitely.
Yeah, the hard work and the discipline.
Alongside obviously the demand from the segment, the niche you are trying to reach. Lars said.
And we have a question from George about what type of people do you hire, like visionaries, doers, et cetera, in different phases of your company, so early stage or later?
Well, in our case, we're hiring all engineers, so we actually hired through the network, through the MIT network, and I highly encourage you to look at your networks and keep track of people. And when you're looking for people, just mention it to anyone you talk to, because there's such an amazing filter that goes on. You know, I would be at a cocktail party and I'd say, we're looking for a software engineer. And if someone I know knows someone who's looking for a job, or knows someone who knows someone, you know, there's a tremendous filter that's happened there that's very powerful. So we were hiring all engineers for a period of time, and then years into it, started hiring people more on the business development side, sales side, that sort of thing. And it took a while. And yeah, it definitely shifts over time. But I think my message is just the power of the network and finding the right people and the good people.
Well, what about the personality dynamic? I mean, if you're a co-founding team and you're hiring your early joiner, that's different, like different types of personalities, regardless of skill sets, than if you're 50 people and you've just taken on a $5 million Series A and you're paying them a salary. Like, how does that dynamic come into play, and what are your guys' thoughts on that?
Well, I think culture, it's really important to be able to articulate your company's culture and to make that very clear in the interview process so people can self-select out. And if you're not hiring too fast, you can bring people into your culture. It's when you hire too many people too fast that then it's hard to keep your culture intact.
Yeah, to build on that, I think culture is a key thing, but also making sure that you have diversity and that you bring, because sometimes it can happen that you create a culture that is too closed or narrow, and you don't allow like different sort of people with different backgrounds to be part of that. So by creating an open culture from the beginning and including bringing diversity into the recruitment side of things, I think that's a key part.
Yeah. We have a very targeted question. Is it possible to pursue a PhD and build a company at the same time?
Yes, of course.
Well, yes. Being embedded in a university.
You said yes, of course. So let's hear why, and then we'll hear.
You know, a lot of the Well, so I would recommend that you're doing a PhD in the field that you're
Yeah.
building a company in. Right? So Google very famously was started by PhD students who took their research at Stanford and turned it into Google. Actually didn't even bother to finish their PhD, I think. And I think increasingly when you look at the promising startups out there, more and more, it's really deep research being commercialized. I think the world is moving in that direction. I personally just love reading about these sorts of startups. Gives me a great sense of optimism that this sort of research can turn into scalable solutions to solve many of the deep problems that the world is facing.
Yeah, I would say you can kind of start moving some parts, probably, I would say. Again, I would agree with Lars on, obviously the research is based on, is around kind of the field where you want to build the startup from. But I don't think you can do literally just starting with a business at the same time as doing the DPhil. I mean, that can be tricky. And we have several programs for DPhils, but they all come when the last year, when they start sort of exploring, they are already close to finish it, and they are making some connections, they are meeting with some business leaders, building the team. So I would say I wouldn't start at the same time, probably towards the end of the, but it's a great, and I would say many of the deep tech entrepreneurs that we most successful at Oxford have a DPhil before starting the business, so it's a great.
Well, I love this question because it talks about failure, but we have a question that says, most startups fail, so the odds are against the founders. How do you decide when to keep pushing and when to call it quits? And I'll add on a component of that, when to pivot, because I think that's also an element that doesn't necessarily get recognized, because it's not just we keep doing or we stop. There's an element of, do we change what we're doing? So how to make that decision? I know, I see the sighs and the laughters.
I mean, look, it's super hard because when I look at my own journey, right, my biggest success, Google Maps, when I tell that story, there are particular points where it was really tempting to give up. I really thought, this is just not going to work, right? And then we decided to continue really because no one was hiring. And then it became this big success anyway. And so I tend to, later on in my journey, I tend to not give up easily and attribute the not giving upness of my early journey to the success. On the other hand, then you have to suffer the consequence. Right? When you work on something that's not actually going to work, it will take you longer, and the failure will be more painful. But that is still my recommendation, right? To really not give up easily. About the pivot. I think I have observed, both from my own portfolio, but also from just looking at other things, that there's kind of two types of pivots out there. There is we tried something, it didn't work, then we had another idea that's sort of relevant, and now we're going to try this out. So those types of pivots often fail, I find. But if you try out a thing and it didn't quite work, but in the course of trying that out, you learn something key, some key user behavior, and you pivot around that. So that's really what a pivot means, right? You have to have something to pivot around. So like Instagram very famously was originally a full-fledged Facebook-like social network that didn't really take off, but they had these cool photo filters that people really loved, right? And so the pivot was to just take that feature and build a whole new photo sharing app, really, that then started taking off like crazy.
Yeah, I would say it has to do a lot with the energy that you also have, but I think you need to give yourself a deadline somehow and decide and say, what are you happy to lose, or what are you gonna offer, and to what extent, where is the limit, and put yourself a limit. And when you've gone through that limit, it can be time, can be money, it can be cash coming in from the business, but you just need to set some limits and say, look, up to here, I'm happy to continue, but probably if I go to the limit of, being, 3 years without, 2 years without earning a salary, for example, you need to set your limits, and that helps you to sort of take some calculated risks. And I think that's good, because sometimes it's discount your whole energy and give your whole energy and life to one idea, because and continue. Persistence is good, but being savvy to give up at the right time is also great, I think.
Well, I think you also have to always keep checking in on the bottom line. Like, are your assumptions broken? Like, were you just fundamentally wrong? Or is the technology just not going to work? Or is there, like, can you envision the economics working for the customer, for you as a business? Or, you know, is there new information that makes that impossible? And so I think understanding what are the deal breakers, because I've seen that where companies will develop a technology and it's going better and better and better, but fundamentally at the end of the day, like, the economics just aren't going to work. Like, they're selling a piece of hardware at 25% gross margin. You just can't make that work. Like, that's just not going to become a viable business.
So we have a bunch of other questions. Apologies to the audience if we weren't able to get to yours, but I think we've got 4 seconds left. They'll kick us off in a minute, but I'd love to be able to close with you guys being able to share just what you would pass along as a key piece of learning, open-ended, but we seems like from the questions from the audience, we have a lot of aspiring entrepreneurs, so I want you to be able to speak directly to them.
Yeah, well, so I can start. So, you know, I think entrepreneurship is great. I attribute all my professional success and so on to being willing to do that. It is also really hard work. It's really hard work, and it's a roller coaster. It's an emotional roller coaster. We've all been through this, right? So it's almost like being professionally bipolar, where you go through these incredible highs that then are followed by, wow, this is the worst thing ever. Oh, thank you. I know you're clapping at the other guys.
I think that might have to be our closing note. Thank you, everyone.